Before I announce today's webinar topic and speakers, I'd like to do a plug for an upcoming webinar that we're planning, which is really getting at the heart of this series in the terms of replacing all the conferences and opportunities that we're missing to engage and hear from emerging researchers. We're going to be having a lightning round of webinar from students, focusing on grad students. So we really want to hear from all grad students who are currently or have recently completed their master's or PhD theses. If you can go to the Gather website on the Brain and Mind Centre, then we can fill out a short form and let us know if you're interested in giving us a quick presentation and run through of your overall thesis topic. We're going to be having that in August, so the deadline for that will be the end of July. So please, if you know any excellent grad students, no matter what stage of their candidature they're at, please encourage them to fill out that so we can reflect all the upcoming research that we're all going to be hearing about over the next few years. Now for today, we're working on a topic that I'm personally very interested in and have done a lot of work since I started on this topic doing my honours thesis. Today we're talking about messaging for gambling and particularly focusing on sustainable or responsible, safe levels of gambling. And we've got two experts. One is an emerging career researcher. One has been in the field for many years, so we've got a wealth of expertise. I'll hand over to Khalil now to introduce our speakers.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Sally, and welcome back, everybody. I'm very excited for the conversation that we have set up today. We have two really interesting speakers with very diverse perspectives on this issue. And so I'm excited to talk about this responsible gambling messaging topic, one that I've also done some work in. And this is actually going to be, I think, the first in the series of some more applied seminars that we have coming up in responsible gambling. So we're lucky to have these two speakers. So without further delay, allow me to introduce first Dr. Jamie Webb. Dr. Jamie Webb has more than 20 years of direct research experience in the areas of problem and responsible gambling research. She's currently the director of player health at BCLC, which is a Crown corporation that conducts and manages gambling in the province of British Columbia. She's also formerly my boss, so I'm very glad to have her as part of the conversation here too. It's always a pleasure to see her. Also part of the conversation is Dr. Rob Harin from the University of Sydney. Rob is a postdoctoral research associate at the Gambling Research and Treatment Clinic based within the Brain and Mind Centre of the University of Sydney. We're presenting this seminar as well. His research focuses on a variety of topics within the field of addiction, including reducing gambling-related harm, assessment and treatment of alcohol-related cognitive impairment, exploring the parallels between experiences of extreme sport athletes and those with substance and behavioral addictions, and the transparency of methodological rigor and additional research. So thank you both very much for joining us. And if you'd like further information about their backgrounds, you can find it in the description of the YouTube chat. So without further delay, what I would like to do is just basically hand the conversation over to Rob. So Rob has done quite a bit of research in this area. And what we've asked Rob to do is to help level set the conversation, to give a short presentation of where the literature is at kind of historically and in the present day as far as responsible gambling messaging goes. So I'll just hand the conversation over to you, Rob.
Hi, Khalil. Hello, can you see me? Hello, yeah. So thanks, Khalil. Thank you to you and Sally for having me on today. So when you asked me to provide this level set of the literature, I kind of saw it as a bit of a challenge to see just how much of the literature I could cover in just one slide and in 5 to 10 minutes or so. So I've developed this slide here, which I think includes most of the literature over the last 20 years on this topic. It's actually 18 years, but I thought 20 years sounded a little bit better. And I divided it into 5 overlapping phases. And within each of the phases, the research roughly coheres in terms of the topics covered. I'll go through each of them and hopefully this will set us up well for the rest of the webinar. So the first phase of research was conducted in the early 2000s, mostly focused on providing proof of concept. So determining whether these messages that are sent to players either before playing or during play actually have the desired effect. So do they influence people's thoughts and gambling behaviors? Do they improve people's understanding of gambling? And they were mostly conducted, in fact, they were all conducted using simulated gambling machines in the lab. And they were all focused on using messages that were aimed to address cognitive misconceptions. So things like the illusion of control or the gambler's fallacy and the independence of events. And what they found is that, yes, these messages were quite useful. They seem to have the desired effect, although only as much as giving people a forced break in play. And unfortunately, most of these studies are characterized by relatively small sample sizes, all conducted in the lab and with university students. I think the first study is the worst culprit. It describes its sample as 5 adult human females, which I thought was rather bizarre. So moving on from that first phase into the second phase, this is mostly focused, the research in this section, on the presentation and delivery of messages and optimizing that. And this is where you can see Sally comes online and starts to really dominate the literature. And in her studies, both in the lab and in live trials, as you can see here from the little tags, green and blue tags that I've included with the key down the bottom, they compared messages that were presented either in the center of the screen as a pop-up or on the periphery. And they also compared messages that were presented statically somewhere on the screen or dynamically, so they moved across. And what they found was that, unsurprisingly, the messages that were presented dynamically and those that were presented in the center of the screen were more effective. They were more easily recalled by gamblers after play, and gamblers thought that they were more impactful. They changed their thinking and gambling behavior to a greater extent, and in the lab settings, they thought that it would when they played on actual gambling machines. Then the third phase was focused on the content of messages and comparing messages that were informative, like in the first phase, so things like messages that addressed cognitive misconceptions with informative messages, with self-appraisal messages. So the informative messages were things like all outcomes are randomly determined by chance, whereas the self-appraisal messages were focused on getting people to evaluate their own play and their own expenditure. So things like, have you spent more than you intended? Do you need to think about taking a break? And what they found is that the self-appraisal messages were more easily recalled. They were more impactful. Again, they changed gamblers' views of their gambling and understanding of their gambling to a greater extent compared to the informative messages. Then there's also a trial here by Ayer and Griffiths, which was conducted with a large sample of slot machine players. And what they found was that if they sent people a simple reminder when they had reached 1,000 slot machine games, it was effective for a really small percentage at making them stop gambling at that point. And if they included normative feedback in there, saying very few people reach 1,000 games, that actually improved the number of people that stopped gambling there and then. Then moving on to the fourth phase, which is mostly dominated by Michael Wall and colleagues, and that research focused on promoting specific behaviors. So the messages were aimed at getting people mostly to set and adhere to monetary and time limits. And what they did is present these messages to people before they started playing, asking them to set a limit or suggesting that they do, or as they approached their limit, reminding them that they were nearing their limit. And what they found is that, yes, these messages, again, did seem to work. They seemed to encourage people both to set and adhere to their limits. And then as we go down from the towards the end of this section, you've got a trial by the Behavioural Insights team conducted in the UK in 2018, which was really interesting. They worked with 2 different online gambling operators in the UK, and they identified players who were at risk based on the inbuilt identification systems that the operators already had in place. And they sent them messages encouraging the use of different responsible gambling tools, so things like deposit limits or timeouts, depending on the specific behaviors that they were displaying. And they also varied the message type as well. So they included self-appraisal feedback and normative feedback, saying that they'd spend much more money than other people. And what they found was that actually none of the differences in content really affected the outcomes. It didn't really affect how many people used the responsible gambling tools in response to those messages. But what they did find is that the level of friction did affect whether people use the tools and the effectiveness of the messages. So the number of steps between, say, seeing the message and then being able to actually use a timeout or a deposit limit was the only thing that affected whether they were useful or not. And then in the final study here, I put a trial that both Sally and I recently ran, working with 4 online wagering operators in Australia. And what we did was send messages to players to encourage the use of deposit limits. And unlike the Behavioural Insights project, they weren't targeted in response to certain risk identifiers. They were just sent to everyone who met certain eligibility criteria. And we varied the messages in different ways. So we changed the content from just very basic informative messages saying this is what deposit limits are, this is what they're useful for, to messages that were game framed and said this is what you can gain from setting a deposit limit. And then also they included a socially referenced email saying this is what other people do, they use these tools and they found them useful. And what we found is that in about 32,000 people involved in the trial, those that received a socially referenced email or message were much more likely to set deposit limits in response to the messages. And we also sent half of the messages via email and half via in-account notification or pop-up notifications. And what we found is that the latter of those was also much more effective at encouraging people to set deposit limits. And then finally, we have the last phase of research and the most recent, which is the most relevant to this conversation today. But I won't go into detail on that right now because I believe we're going to come back to that in a moment.
Well, great. Thank you very much for that overview, Rob. I know it's not easy to constrain 20 years worth of research into about 5 minutes. So thank you for doing that. I'll turn the conversation over to Jamie now. I'm going to ask her to summarize 20 years worth of activity as well. But I'm going to ask her. So for those who don't know, Jamie was a longtime director of is a director of research at the Center for the Advancement of Best Practices at the Responsible Gambling Council. Yeah, and so that you have a long history of these social marketing information programs, and I was wondering if, taking your experience there as well as your experience now working at BCLC, would you mind just giving us a brief history of what we've learned in that sort of perspective over that similar 20-year time horizon?
So when you say brief, you mean brief? I could go on forever about this. Like, it's so interesting when you when we talked about this session and you talked about this being a potential question, and I'd never really thought about it. And the more I get into it, the more interesting it becomes. But anyway, first of all, thanks. Thank you so much, Cleo and Sally, for letting me be part of the session today. So I don't have a slide, but it may look like I have a slide, but I'm just looking at my my screen here. And it's interesting because when you go back, when it all began, when gambling first started to come on the scene in Canada in the late 90s, and when you look at then till now, it's incredible the different learnings that we've had. So, and I think with each phase, and I've given them my own names, there have been some real nuggets of value to carry us forward. So initially, when gambling started to expand, the approach was what I call the fear-based phase. It was really focused on telling people that gambling is here and there can be huge problems with gambling and people need to watch out. It wasn't uncommon to see like the use of rabid dogs and scenes of death and destruction to portray what a gambling problem looked like. I'm not kidding you. Amazing language to go along with these images of rabid dogs, including compulsive gambler, pathological gambling, sorry, not gambling, gambler, you know, huge stigma and labeling. Of course, the stuff resonated with nobody, and it probably didn't win us any favors with government and industry either. So thankfully, that phase was left behind, and we entered what I call the literal phase. The nice thing about the literal phase is that we got off just the focus on problems, and we started looking at actual prevention. The thing about it was, though, is literal. Like, it was like our message was set a limit and stick to it. Hey, there are risks associated with gambling. You should know this. Spending more than you can afford is a sign of a problem. And from these messages over time, we learned that, first of all, people are much smarter than what we give them credit for. And even if they didn't know the information beforehand, it really wasn't resonating. We weren't hitting them on an emotional level. For the most people, for the most part, people don't think that the messages that we're giving apply to them, or that they need the information. I can tell you, in years of doing research with people who are experiencing problems with gambling, not one of them said that they could see themselves having a gambling problem. Quite the opposite. They never thought it could happen to them. So simply telling someone, hey, you know, set a limit, stick to it, or there are risks associated with gambling, is not that different than, you know, telling my 65-year-old aunt to that smoking can cause health problems. You know, if anything, she'll probably go outside and smoke even more. Thankfully, that phase ended, and we entered what I call the connection phase. And that's where we realized we needed different messages for different people. This was they entered the age of 1 million prevalence studies, where we got much more informed that gambling is a continuum, and there's people along this continuum of risk, from no to low, moderate, and high. Not all people are the same. From the prevalence studies in Ontario, when I was working with John Kelly at the Responsible Gambling Council, much of our focus became the 18 to 24-year-old group, simply because they had a 7% rate of moderate to high gambling problems compared to the general population that was 3.2 or 3.4. So they became an important target group. We also learned during this phase that we've been asking people to do a lot. You know, when we tell someone, don't gamble when you're depressed or anxious, that's asking them a lot. Or set a budget, know what you can afford, and stick within that budget. There's a lot that has to go into that. And we knew that we had to keep the message simple and specific. And this is not dissimilar to the very simple and effective message of don't drink and drive. The problem is that we don't have a simple message when it comes to gambling. You don't have, like, don't gamble and lose money. Like, there's not this equivalent. So we had to look for one, and we had to look for one in the prevention realm. And what we came upon was the value of focusing on chasing losses. It was very difficult to find someone who had a gambling problem who had not chased losses. But the nice thing about focusing on chasing losses as well is it kind of marks that point in a gambler's history where the relationship with gambling has changed, but not necessarily have they yet experienced the significant negative consequences in terms of finances and work and relationships. So we were all over the chasing as our new kind of driver. We also learned that we had to get under the behavior. You couldn't just go out and say, hey, 18 to 24-year-olds, chasing's bad. Don't chase don't chase your gambling losses. So we did so much focus group testing, which, you know, to this day, it's one of the most invaluable lessons and learning opportunities I've ever had. And we got to get under what is involved with chasing. What do they think about chasing? And from that, evolved the concept of perseverance. Perseverance is a concept that is of great importance to, well, all people really, but particularly this age group. So the more you try, the more you work, the harder, you know, success will come eventually. So we wanted to use perseverance to get across the message of chasing, and we wanted to focus on the 18 to 24-year-olds. We had so many renditions of creative concepts to test for them. This is where the other learning came in. just because I like something doesn't mean that the target likes it. And you have to leave your opinions at the door, because it really doesn't matter if you're not the target group. So, just kind of funny story. We thought we were so clever, and we came up with these famous quotes, and we're going to turn them around. So you have Vince Lombardi saying, "Winners never quit and quitters never win." And we're going to turn that around, that quitters always win. And anyway, to make the point that chasing is kind of a losing proposition, we used a quote by Winston Churchill, "Never, never, never give up." But what came out of the focus groups was, first of all, they thought it was really stupid. But second, a lot of them didn't even know who Winston Churchill was. So like we had to let that one go. Eventually we came across the one that worked. The other thing I learned in these focus groups is like little details matter a lot. We had some concepts where the guy was dressed in kind of like, he had a skateboard, he was very casual, and they felt like that really wouldn't resonate, that he had to be dressed nicer, like not suit-like, but it really, like, this is the kind of stuff that they're paying attention to and actually really, really mattered. I also learned, not from the focus groups, but when we did the post tests, because like this is like $10 million worth of campaigns over the years that we did. We spent a lot of money on this stuff. So we had highly sophisticated evaluations in turn. I also learned that just because someone doesn't like the ad doesn't mean it wasn't a good ad. In fact, we would have really negative comments about the ad, but when you looked at pre-post behavior, sometimes those are the people that were most impacted because it hit home. And so them disliking it wasn't because they disliked the ad so much, but they disliked the fact that, yeah, you were speaking to me, and I had to take a look at myself. So in summary, getting to the point, I would say I learned the following in terms of best practices going through 20 years of social marketing campaigns. First of all, I cannot say enough about how important it is to test your message with the target group. Second, people aren't stupid. If it was so easy to change behavior, everyone, no one would be smoking, kind of thing. So you have to get under the behavior. It reminds me of a conference that we had where Theo Fleury, who is a former pro hockey player, came and spoke about some of the struggles he had. He had past issues with drug use, but he also had a gambling problem. And he said that gambling was never the problem, it was a solution to a problem. And that's always resonated with me when we think about how we can best speak to someone about a message that's important. And finally, I would say that it's really important to sustain the message. Years of prevention work in tobacco, safe sex tells us as soon as you stop focusing on the message, those behaviors will start creeping up again. And so that's what I have to say about that question, Khalil.
Well, thank you very much, Jamie. That was fantastic. I thought that's a really interesting idea, as somebody who thought a lot about these responsible gambling programs before, the idea of focusing on chasing losses, because some of the things that we want to try to change as far as like the way that people think about playing these games, it's just hard to make people think that they already have a distorted view about things. But chasing losses is something that's just easily identifiable by anybody, right? And so focusing on that as part of the practice for your targeted messaging makes a lot of sense. I want to follow up with Rob. Yeah.
Just one thing I wanted to add. So we did the chasing for years. And the other thing that was nice about that concept was we could also appeal to friends. So friends know when friends are chasing. And so it was also awesome because this group cares about their friends, to appeal to the friends. If you see your friend doing this, da, 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 da. So it wasn't just self-reflection and self-awareness, but it was also leading on the friendships that they had. Anyway, thanks.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's actually really great. And, you often get asked about like what types of things can we do that's actually actionable. And that's, I think a really great takeaway in addition to the other things that you mentioned. Rob, so what Jamie described there, it seems like the practices in trying to educate people about responsible gambling overlaps pretty closely with the research. And I don't know what the direction of causality is, if it's research influencing practice or vice versa, perhaps a little bit of both. But like you mentioned at the outset, it seems like the latest trend from a research perspective is in this customizing, personalizing messages. Jamie talked a little bit about customizing based on user groups, but I know there's even more personalized messages that are being developed in online operators right now. From a research standpoint, Rob, is there any sort of evidence that actually supports that as a strategy, or is this just people, following their own intuition, but we don't necessarily know if this is actually helpful or not?
Yeah, Khalil, yeah, there certainly is evidence to support exactly what Jamie is saying, in numerous different ways. So we don't just customize messages in terms of the groups, but there are other ways. And I'll talk through some of the studies that have been conducted and hopefully illustrate the numerous different ways in which messages are customized. I'll start with a study that Sally and I recently did, which relates to Jamie's point about actually testing the messages with your target group before you're using them. So in the messaging trial that Sally and I conducted, we pilot tested all of a variety of different messages that we developed promoting deposit limits before actually using them in a live trial. And we actually used a consumer marketing platform operated by one of the online wagering operators. And they got, in 3 polls, around 250 people each time to rate the messages that we developed along a scale from 1 to 7. For 1 being, this wouldn't make me set a deposit limit, to 7, this would be really likely to make me set a deposit limit. And we also gave them the option to include some text feedback. And when I got the results back, it really highlighted to me the need for this personalization or customization of messages. So there was really strongly diverse views, not just across messages, but within each messages between players. So I've got one message here that we developed, and then I'll read some of the comments for you as a bit of an example of that. So this is one of our more informal, colloquial messages we developed. It was, gambling should be about fun, not money management. Set a deposit limit. Then here are some of the comments we got. This is the best one, as it's clear and to the point. Helps you remember it starts as fun. My favorite one. Not a fan. Boring. Sounds like a nagging mother. The worst one. So we've got the real spectrum of people's opinions there, just for one message, one single message, which really highlighted, as I said, that we need to be thinking about how we can identify different preferences. And unfortunately, because this was just pilot work, we didn't collect demographic details. We weren't able to tell whether we could differentiate these groups based on age or gender or so on. But it does highlight that need. But there have been other studies conducted. So Khalil, as you well know, you and Sally conducted a study in 2018. We used focus groups with different cohorts of gamblers. So younger gamblers, older adults, and skilled gamers. So people who bet on sports and people who played poker. And you got them to test different messages, see what they liked, what they didn't like. And there were some similarities. All people liked positive, non-judgmental language, unsurprisingly. But the groups did have different preferences. So just briefly, the skilled gamers, for example, wanted to know about the odds, and they wanted to know how much money they were spending and losing over time. So kind of like a transaction statement. The older adults wanted messages about limits, and the younger adults wanted messages that were about themselves and their expertise and chance of winning. So again, there's this demographic split in terms of what people want. But then there are other ways in which we can think about how we might personalize them. So there's another theory that's been recently developed by Langham, which is called the Intelligent Messages Theory or Framework. And what this proposes is that people who will have higher problem gambling scores or are at greater risk of problem gambling need different types of messaging to people who have lower risk, kind of related to what Jamie said earlier. And they've developed this framework that suggests messages should vary across 2 dimensions. So the first is message frame, ranging from being gain framed and positive, this is what we can gain from doing this behavior, to very negative, this is what you could lose, this is the consequences of engaging in this behavior. And then the other dimension going down is the purpose of the message, ranging from informative messages, just telling people about the behavior, to more self-appraisal messages, which I talked about earlier. And according to this framework, people should be, who are at greater risk of problems, should be sent messages which are negatively framed and self-appraising. And there was a study by Armstrong in 2018 and colleagues, and they tested this proposition. And what they found is that actually the people's problem gambling score didn't moderate the effects of these messages. So just because somebody had a high problem gambling score didn't mean they responded well in a simulated gambling experiment to negative messages that were self-appraising. But what they did find was that there were clear gender differences. So for example, males responded very negatively to messages that were classified as being positively phrased and self-evaluating. So the actual message they used was, "You're playing faster than most people. Are you enjoying every spin?" Which I thought was rather strange, but what that actually led to was them increasing their gambling expenditure and behavior, but not in females. And the same for women, when they read the messages that were supposedly supposed to help the most, which was negatively phrased and self-evaluating, which was, "You're playing faster than most people, you're playing at a similar speed to most problem gamblers." What they found was that led to, again, increased gambling expenditure and so on. So it had the counterproductive effect. So there's that, another type of customization. But then there's also customization in terms of when we send the messages. So sending them in response to specific risk behaviors like the behavioural insights team did, and like Ayer and Griffiths recently did in a 2020 study. And so far, those seem to be effective, more so than just sending a message at any time, if we compare them with the results from our recent study. And then there's also including personalized information in the form of expenditure information and how that relates to other people's expenditure, so normative information. So the behavioural insights team did this in their trial, and they found that actually it didn't affect the outcomes at all. And a study by Hollingshead, published last year, did something similar, but when they were reminding people that they'd approached their limits, they sent them all of their expenditure information. This is how much you spent in actual monetary values. And again, that didn't seem to have any effect. So to summarize, there is preliminary evidence that customizing and personalizing messages is useful, but mostly in terms of dividing people based on demographic groups and sending messages that are targeted temporarily. So they're sent when people are displaying at-risk behaviors, as opposed to sending people their own expenditure information and normative information.
Thanks for that overview, Rob. It's this branch of research really makes my head hurt, because I wonder how much of it is actually connected to any sort of perpetual phenomenon, or whether it's all basically idiosyncratic. And I see that Oliver commented earlier, based on our conversation from last week, like, I wonder what portion of these can exactly be replicated. And that's something that I wonder about too, is like, are we just finding just narrow phenomena here, or is there some sort of unifying theory, at least about some people or some activities or some behavior that, you know, we've yet to bring together. But I think, you know, the type of work that you're working on, that Jamie was working on, is starting to build us towards that. I just, you know, I at times I struggle to make sense of where it all fits together. And I could stay on that point for a while, but I want to pivot over to a different conversation with Jamie. Jamie, I know you manage a large group of individuals that have personal conversations with gamblers every day, and we're talking about personalized messages here. So I'm just curious if you could just kind of briefly tell us about the GameSense Advisor Program, what it is, and then what insights you can share from that program about how to communicate with gamblers.
Would love to. So we have GameSense advisors in all, like, we have over 40 GameSense advisors in all the casinos and venues throughout the province. And basically they provide staff and customers with information, education, as well as assistance and participate in the BSE program and do referrals and assist if there's a breach and all these things. And so when I was asked to participate in this study, and we talked about maybe what are the best practices when when you have actual conversations one-on-one. I did reach out to all the team leads who reached out to the Game Sense advisors, and so we have a little, you're the first to have these off the press results from that highly scientific survey that we just conducted for you and Sally, Cleo, just for you. But it was kind of interesting, and it wasn't really surprising. One of the, in terms of the do's or what makes it work, one of the biggest things that was mentioned is the opportunity to build relationships. So people are not coming up to the Game Sense advisors and saying, hey, hi, by the way, I have a problem. And it mostly never happens that way. It takes time, and you can have many conversations before someone discusses having some issues with their gambling. Another thing is be respectful. Don't try to have serious conversations while the individual is gambling. This is very consistent with work we did when we developed a report on best practices on how to approach someone on the venue floor when they might be having a problem with gambling. And the gamblers who actually were in treatment made it very clear that, they might be very angry if this happened. By the way, they were also clear to say that this had never happened. And they were pretty sure that people knew that they were having issues with their gambling. But however, if it was to happen, it may plant a seed on their way home and give them something to think about. So it could be quite valuable, even if they got angry at it. And that if it was done respectful. And also they mentioned that if there was a sign, almost like when you go into Starbucks and it's like this code of conduct for customers, if there was a sign, hey, because we care about your well-being, if we see X, Y, and Z, we may have a conversation with you. They said that they would feel less kind of targeted. So that was very interesting. I like this point. I hadn't thought about this, but focus on what the person likes and doesn't like about gambling. We're so quick to dismiss anything positive about it. And you can lose people if you don't appreciate the fact that there's elements of gambling that obviously are working in some way. Otherwise, the person would not probably continue to gamble. Put emphasis on and give affirmations for the positive behaviors that the patron is doing, no matter how small. Some of the things that they mentioned not to do is don't use the term problem unless the player uses the term. Remember, you're speaking to adults. I like this one. Don't be quick to correct people. Effective myth busting happens when you take time to understand fully how the person thinks gambling works, or why they chase losses, and etc. Be careful with gambling terminology. Random and lucky mean different things. And be careful with using humor as well. But I wanted to share with you an actual conversation. So in March, when all the venues closed, we were really concerned about our customers. We're concerned about those that could no longer gamble. And for many of them, talking to the GSA is a real social thing. It's an important part of what they do when they come to the venues. And so that connection was lost, but we also wanted to be there in a real way for people who, might be experiencing isolation and loneliness, anxiety, depression, at home, might be playing online, or might be playing more online. So moving to online are those that are already online. And we were able to very quickly, and it's quite exciting, make the GSAs available through the customer support center. So through telephone or through chat on the Play Now site. And I just wanted to give you an example of some of the communication and what a like a conversation may look like, because I think this one is a really positive one. It was a 21-minute conversation, and I'm not going to, Khalil, don't worry, I'm not going to take 21 minutes to go over I'm going to summarize the conversation. But a woman called the customer support center and was transferred to the GSA. She said that the pay lines are not lining up like they once did, and the game has been changed. The GSA said, these are common concerns I hear a lot. Would you like to learn more about how the games work and the odds of winning? She says that she spoke to someone else earlier, but they were not telling the truth. She wanted to know if BCLC had been tightening the machines with the loss of income from casinos during the shutdowns. The GSA said, no, that's not the case at all. And BCLC prides themselves in being, honest and blah, 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 blah. She said, well, these changes happening in the world have been really stressful, and I don't know what to do with myself. So now we're going from the tightening of the machines and us changing things to get more money to, well, it seems like she's experiencing some things from the being at home and with COVID. And so the GSA says the closures have been really hard on a lot of people. Can I ask, are you doing okay? As the conversation continued, the player talked about the stress due to COVID-19. The player still felt unsure as to whether the games were changed, to which they talked a bit more about patterns of randomness and near wins. The player expressed gratitude for the conversation, and although they still felt sadness, they were relieved that the company was not preying on people during these times. The GSA encouraged the player set limits, informed them to call back any time. And I think this is just such a great example of, this was 21 minutes, but it took some time to build trust, to gain rapport, to be able to give her information about the odds and maybe explore some of the things that she was going through, as well as the tools that are available to her. But it shows that just a message that said, nothing had been changed, or we have this tool to set your limits, would not have had the same impact in this situation. So I just think it's a really great example of a conversation that can go so well and can be so valuable.
That's a really great example, Jamie. Thanks for sharing that. And it does kind of speak to a different side of the ethos, pathos, logos. I'm not very good at the Latin part. I think that's Latin, of persuasion when it comes to, the having some sort of authority to speak about something. But if the player doesn't see you as somebody who is actually invested in their well-being, then they're not going to necessarily be persuaded by your message at all. And that's, we often appeal to logic when it comes to messaging, and we often appeal to emotions, whether that's fear or some sort of social pressure. But that other piece of the ancient forms of persuasion is something that we haven't necessarily figured out how to do in a messaging form yet. So thank you for sharing that. Rob, we've gotten a few questions that I think you could help us answer, and I want to integrate these into another question I want to ask you as well. So this is going to be a triple barrel question. So Jamie's approach with all this is a very non-compliance based approach, which is different from other jurisdictions. So I was wondering if you could talk about what type of content we normally see in a lot of jurisdictions, which might not be that way, and what type of content or features that RG managers or regulators should think about integrating instead. Perhaps speaking to Eric's comment about, what's the difference between land-based versus online, or Richard's conversation when he was asking about whether things that we test in a research lab are actually effective in changing behaviors. Is there any sort of general guidance or specific guidance that you can give people who actually have to develop these types of messages, what they should start thinking about doing if they're already just in a very generic type of messaging environment?
Yeah, I think there are a number of different things that we need to think about. To just answer some of those questions specifically, I think, first of all, in terms of online versus land-based gambling, I think the main difference is that at the moment, online just has so much more capability for personalization and for targeted messages. We can communicate with people pretty much at any time, whether they're in the venue or not, and often hold a lot more information about them that could be useful for personalization, except in land-based venues where we have member-based systems, but that even then the information available isn't as rich as online. And in terms of, I think that's a really interesting question and something that we've thought about, whether the findings from focus groups actually are useful in terms of, are they consistent, the views that people give in focus groups and their ratings of messages, with what actually changes behavior, and whether there's a difference yet or not, I don't think we know. I think there's not been enough consistent research that's followed through from that preliminary stage of conducting focus groups to actually testing them in live environments. So I think that's definitely something we need to do. But then to go back to the key points in your question. So I think I'll focus on what I think we need to include, and hopefully in doing so answer the other part of the question, which is what are other jurisdictions including in their messages. So the first thing I think is, ironically, in responsible gambling messages, to avoid the term responsible gambling and government speak and formal language like that, which is, I think, something Jamie was alluding to earlier. And I first became aware of this when I started the messaging trial that Sally and I ran. I met with all of the different operators involved in the trial and wanted to get their view on their marketing history and messaging history, what they knew worked and what didn't seem to work. And consistently, each of them, the first thing they said was, don't use the phrase responsible gambling, and don't include anything that sounds like the government mandated messages that the operators are given in Australia, which are things like stay in control, leave before you lose it, gamble responsibly. And they said that their customers seem to find these quite as if they're insinuating that people have problems with gambling and judgmental, and they don't like them. And there is empirical evidence then to support that point. So in 2017, there was a study conducted by Munyurak, I'm probably butchering that name, but it was in France. And what they did is compare the government mandated messages with some informative messages that they developed. So the government mandated messages were gamble in a balanced way, keep it fun, stay in control, and gamble responsibly. Versus messages that they developed, which were focused on cognitive misconceptions. So don't forget that you have no control over chance, and remember that this is a game of chance, and others that were similar. And what they found was that all of the participants in this survey found that the government messages were, first of all, less preventative. They didn't seem to have the same useful effects in preventing problem gambling, according to their view. And they also found them really ambiguous and difficult to interpret. They weren't very clear in their communicated value, as they called it. So I think the first thing then is perhaps avoiding any sort of language that implies that the onus is on individuals to be responsible. Then I guess other than that, there are some provisional suggestions that we can make based on the findings in the literature. So I think Sally's research has shown that consistently self-appraisal messages seem to be more useful than simple informative messages. And it's not that educating people about the how outcomes are determined and trying to address erroneous cognitions isn't useful, but I think perhaps it's difficult to communicate such complex information in the form of a pop-up message and to change people's quite inveterate and long-standing habits and biases in that very simple, short message. So whereas self-appraisal messages might be more useful for that format. And then also, depending on what the message is trying to achieve, if we're trying to look at encouraging certain behaviors like using RG tools, our study would suggest that perhaps messages that are socially referenced and that play on that peer pressure aspect may be useful. And that's consistent with research in other public health domains and with other theories of health behaviors. But I think now what we really need is more of what I just alluded to, more live trials in actual gambling environments with expenditure information to determine what actually works and best in terms of the general content and what works in terms of personalizing messages.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. Jamie, we're already getting short on time, which seems to happen every week. It's a chronic issue that I don't know how to fix. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask you if you would mind providing some closing thoughts about how to think about an operational strategy when it comes to RG messages. I know Rob and you have both touched on a number of different ideas, and we can kind of just say, okay, look to this area. And, you know, I think you're both pretty open, and we have your contact information in the YouTube description. So if people want to reach out, I know they can reach out to you for more details. But if you wouldn't mind just providing some thoughts about how to start to think about operational strategies. And I know it's really asked specifically our favorite Oregonian about the positive play scale and its potential role that it could play into message development. I don't know if that's relevant or not, but do you have any sort of closing thoughts on how to think about a messaging strategy?
I'll really quickly talk about positive play. We use it as kind of to develop targets, the pre-commitment and the literacy, the two scales that we think that we can have some impact on. And what we do is we have those measures by segmentation by product line, and so we can see where the gaps are and set targets and specifically identify the areas that we need to target to increase the positive play score. But I'm happy to talk about those results, and if someone, I think it's Julie, I'm happy to talk to you about that anytime. I think mostly I've kind of alluded to what I think are important things when it comes to operationalizing this. Essentially, if it's more than just giving information, number one thing is to have a strategy. Remember, and have a goal. I am forever amazed at how many messages there are out there or initiatives that where the goal is really a little bit unclear. So is it increased knowledge, increased self-awareness, increase intentions, change behavior, change beliefs? Have a goal and look at what your product is, and does it make sense that product is going to lead to what you think, be realistic about your expectations is what I'm saying. Remember, I think that we have a skeptical, disinterested market surrounded by a whole lot of noise. People are not lining up and banging on the doors for problem gambling prevention messages. Let's be real about that. So I would also argue that it's a bit of art and science. There's a lot to be learned from the marketing community that has been doing this for years and years and years. Behavior change takes time. And I guess finally, and I said this before, it doesn't really matter what you think, it matters what your target market thinks. And so test and segment until you can't test and segment anymore. I can't say enough about spending the time to learn the language and what's meaningful in the target group through focus groups. It's been invaluable in 20 years of doing this.
Thank you, Jamie. Rob, I think we have time for maybe one more question, so I'll give you the last word. For any enterprising young researchers out there, where would you say that we are in the literature right now, and what's the next step? So if somebody was designing a research project in this area with a limited or unlimited budget, where do you think are the areas that are worth looking at?
Good question. I think at the moment, the literature is quite disparate and disconnected. There have been some lines of research that have connected well. Sally's research around informative versus self-appraisal, the delivery of messages. But other than that, I feel like it's been very disconnected. And I think what's needed is to potentially look at replicating some of the existing studies, as I think one of the questions alluded to, because very few of the studies have been replicated, if ever, just to confirm whether some of the things that we think we know actually work in terms of message phrasing and personalization, testing some of the focus group research that's been done, like your study with Sally, Khalil, seeing whether those cohorts do respond to the messages that they said they in the cohorts, in the focus groups.
That's great, yes. So like a lot of things in the field, it seems like there's a great need for replication and validating some of the things that we already believe to be true. Well, thank you both, Jamie and Rob, for joining us as part of this conversation. And thank you everybody who's participated in the chat and contributed to the conversation as well. Next week, we have another conversation that's focused on responsible gambling issues. So to tell us more about that, what I'm going to do is hand the conversation back over to Sally. Sally?
Thanks very much, Khalil, and thank you to Rob and Jamie. I've been working in this field specifically for many years, and I learned a lot from that conversation, so I really appreciate both of yours obvious effort put into preparing for this webinar, and I'm sure that the webinar audience and those who continue to follow after the fact, we'll really appreciate reviewing these notes as well. Next week, we are on a similar topic. We're talking about gambling education programs. So obviously, Rob mentioned the limits of what you can actually put in a message, and Jamie touched on the broader sort of advisory program you can have within a casino or gambling environment. We're going to be getting more into that, looking with Dr. Heather Gray, who's the academic advisor at the Division of Addiction at Cambridge Health Alliance, and Dr. Brittany Keane from the University of Sydney Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic, who conducted her PhD looking at animations from an educational perspective. So we're going to be getting into that topic next week. Please do tell anyone who's interested in this or other webinars. We can obviously catch up on the podcast series, watch the webinars on YouTube after the fact. And of course, again, please tell anyone who's a grad student, even if they're early in their candidature or towards the end of their candidature, if they've graduated very recently. We're looking for the best students to focus and feature on our upcoming lightning round of talks, where they'll have 3 minutes to present their research to a highly receptive and interested audience. So please do encourage anyone who's a grad student to fill out our brief form and submit their details. We'll bring you that special webinar later in August. We have continuing content. If, as always, you have any suggestions for speakers or topics, please shoot Khalil or I an email. Please feel free to get in touch with Jamie and Rob if you have any follow-up questions after today. Thank you, everyone, very much for taking the time, and we look forward to